When General Fritz Schlieper looked at his map on the morning of June 22nd, 1941, he saw a formality. Brest Fortress, a 19th century relic on the new Soviet border, garrisoned by men who weren't even supposed to be there that week. His own 45th Infantry Division had taken Poland in 1939 for the cost of a few hundred dead. Barbarossa's planners had given him a few hours to clear the place, maybe less. He was wrong about almost all of it. What happened next would take a week instead of an afternoon, cost his division more men than the entire Polish campaign, and end with a report in his own handwriting that a year later would read less like an after-action analysis and more like a prophecy of exactly how the war on the Eastern Front was going to go.
General Fritz Schlieper arrived at the gates of Brest Fortress with the kind of confidence that comes from having already won the war. His division was veteran, rested, and equipped for exactly the kind of fast, overwhelming assault that had carried the Wehrmacht across Poland and France without serious interruption. The fortress was not, by 1941, a fortress in any meaningful military sense. It was a 19th century system of earthen ramparts and brick barracks ringing an old town on the river, built for an era of muskets and siege guns, obsolete before the First World War had even started. Its walls couldn't stop modern artillery. The open ground around it offered no cover for a defender. It was being used the way old buildings get used when nobody's thinking about their original purpose. Families lived there. Children went to school there. It was a garrison town in the ordinary, unglamorous sense, where the war that was about to start was still a newspaper story happening to other people.
On the night of the 21st, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men were inside the fortress, not counting families. Most of the troops who were supposed to be there were out on exercises, because that's what a normal summer looked like on a border district in 1941. At 4:15 in the morning, several hundred guns and rocket launchers opened up on the fortress at once, walking the barrage 100 meters east every 4 minutes, methodically tearing the place apart in strips. It wasn't random. In the first minutes, German artillery destroyed the ammunition depots, severed communications with district headquarters, and wrecked the water system. Cut off the water, the communications, and the spare ammunition in the first 60 seconds of a battle, and you've cut off the only thing that turns a garrison into a fighting force. Nobody gave the order to fall back because there was no longer anyone left to give it. And in the smoke and dust of collapsing barracks, men who'd lost their headquarters, their water, and everything except what they were carrying did the only thing they'd been trained to do when nobody was left to tell them otherwise. They kept fighting. German infantry moved into the fortress in the first hours with the unhurried confidence of men finishing paperwork. Assault groups secured the southern and western sections almost immediately. Then they tried to push into the citadel, the fortress's inner core, and the paperwork stopped making sense. At the Terraspol Gate, a German assault group ran into a counterattack led by Regimental Commissar Yefim Fomin, a man whose actual job description had nothing to do with leading troops into combat. The men behind him had been shaken awake by an artillery barrage in the middle of the night, had no contact with anyone above them, and a good number were already wounded. They counterattacked anyway. For 2 days, the Germans tried to take the Holm Gate, the route into the heart of the citadel. Fomin's men threw them back every time. The schedule that had allocated a few hours for the entire fortress had, by the end of day 1, stopped being a schedule at all.
On the northern side of the complex, Major Pyotr Gavrilov pulled together gunners, signalmen, and infantrymen who'd been separated from their units in the opening barrage and organized the defense of the East Fort. By the 24th, defense had consolidated into 2 strongholds, the Citadel, under Captain Ivan Zubachev and Commissar Fomin, and the East Fort, under Major Gavrilov. That same day, in a cellar inside the citadel, the surviving commanders found one another in person. What they produced was, by any reasonable standard, one of the stranger combat orders of the entire war. Order number 1, drafted by men with no contact with front headquarters, no clear picture of anything outside the fortress walls, and no certainty whether the country they were defending was even still standing. They weren't counting men for a report to anyone above them. There was no above them left. They were counting because counting was the only administrative act still available to people who had already decided they weren't stopping.
What followed is hard to describe without sounding implausible. The food stores had been captured by the Germans on day 1. The water system was gone in the opening minutes. Every man who tried to fill a canteen for the wounded was doing it under machine gun fire. The garrison fought off 7 or 8 assaults a day, with no food, no water, in buildings the artillery had already half collapsed, through the heat of a Belarusian July, surrounded by bodies nobody could safely retrieve. When force alone wasn't ending it fast enough, the Germans tried a different kind of pressure. They put a girl who'd been among the civilians inside the fortress in front of an ultimatum. Surrender now, completely, or the fortress and everyone in it gets erased. The girl listened to the terms, walked to the defenders, and didn't walk back. She stayed. The ultimatum failed.
On the 28th and 29th of June, the East Fort took a targeted bombing run with half-ton bombs and one bomb over 1.5 tons. Flamethrowers went in after, burning men out of casemates that infantry couldn't reach any other way. On the 20th of July, someone inside the casemates scratched a line into the brick that millions of people would eventually know by heart. I am dying, but not surrendering. Farewell, motherland.
On the 23rd of July, the 32nd day of the war, a full month after the German General Staff had allotted a few hours for the entire operation, Major Pyotr Gavrilov fought his last engagement and was taken prisoner, wounded, among the last defenders standing. Commissar Fomin was shot almost immediately after capture. Captain Zubachev died in a concentration camp. Gavrilov survived German captivity and was liberated by Soviet forces in May of 1945 in the camp at Mauthausen. Of a garrison that had numbered somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 at the start, roughly 400 were left alive by the time it was over. The German 45th Infantry Division lost 482 men killed, including 48 officers, and more than 1,000 wounded. In Courland, the same division had lost 158 men killed in the entire campaign. Here, it lost nearly 3 times that in a week, taking an objective that was supposed to fall before lunch.
General Schlieper wrote up the assault for the record. In flat, procedural language, he documented something that didn't fit anything the German command had expected. The original plan had failed because German firepower couldn't break the casemates, and because the defenders' resistance had been, in his own word, heroic. And here is the part that turns this from a single grim battle into something larger. A year after Brest, the German army arrived at Stalingrad. Street by street, building by building, German troops met the same refusal to surrender against the same lopsided math of men and resources. German High Command made the same mistake again and again, reading Soviet losses as proof that Soviet resistance had to be running out, when the opposite kept turning out to be true. The lesson Schlieper could have drawn from his own report in the summer of '41 was the lesson the entire German High Command kept rediscovering at enormous cost, through Moscow, through Stalingrad, through Kursk, each time as if for the first time, each time already written down, unread, in a staff file about a small, obsolete fortress on the border that was supposed to fall before lunch. On May 8, 1965, nearly a quarter century later, Brest Fortress was given the title of Hero Fortress. By then, most of the men who'd actually held it were not there to receive it. Gavrilov lived long enough to see it, one of the few witnesses left to a defense that started as a few hours formality and ended up as the rough draft of how the entire war on the Eastern Front was going to be lost.